Do you remember when we covered a number of barbarian invasions, particularly the Huns and maybe to a lesser extent Genghis Khan of the Mongolians? Do you remember where we covered that? And we talked about their technological advancement. Okay, so this would be, I think, a good uh, place to start. So when we think about barbarians versus civilized people, we tend to think in terms of technology. And I think that's actually a reflection of our own barbarianism today. Because technology has, one, not ever really been the sole asset of one particular polity or not. Okay, because the reality is technology always diffuses. And the clearest example is actually the fact that the USSR was able to develop the hydrogen, right? Because you would think that if out of all technology to be protected is nuclear technology, right? But eventually, I mean, you could say, oh, it's because of this or that, right? It did get into not only the USSR, the Soviet Union, but to many other places in the world. Why? Because honestly, it was just a matter of time. And that's why in World War II, everybody was having a kind of race, right? We had the space race in the Cold War, but in World War II, the race was to discover this power, okay, of splitting atoms, okay? Because all of the science had been, all this research had already been conducted and published and known that at least theoretically this should be possible. Okay. So then it became after that point an engineering feat. All right. So that's the thing. Technology diffuses all the time. And you can't ever say, oh, the West has, developed this technology and it would have never been developed without the West. The West may be able to take credit for getting there faster, but it cannot take credit for getting there, period. Okay, because it may have taken longer, but eventually somebody else, as long as you have the ability to generate technology, right, which is not unique to the West, they would have been able to discover it. Okay, let me put it also this way. Um, Europe could not have existed, could not have developed the technology that it had unless they drew heavily from Chinese discoveries and inventions, as well as if you're thinking about things like mathematics, Indian or Arabian, right? Uh, In other words, human technological growth is a human endeavor, right? Or technological growth in general is a human endeavor, right? It's something that is so useful, it is preserved throughout the generations, not perfectly. Sometimes you lose technology, like, we don't really know exactly how the Romans made their really high quality concrete. Okay, we don't really know, so it can be lost, right? But for the most part, it's so useful that you preserve it. Somebody is preserving it, right? Okay. So this idea of one day we won't have any computers is seemingly not, the more I think about it, it seems less and less likely to me. I mean, it's true that we could, let me put it this way, if we lose computer technology, that comes out because we've lost tons of human beings, right? It would just be a complete global catastrophe at that point. Um, or we have to go. I mean, we're talking about completely losing computer technology. I'm not talking about 90% of the world can no longer have computer technology, but somehow 10% of less can. Okay, I'm not talking about that situation. I'm talking about it's just completely gone, right? Um, do you follow me so far, or am I just kind of going way too off?
It makes sense.
Okay. All right. So we have technology, and I think people confuse technology for civilizational advancement. Okay. But the only thing that technology can really tell us about is that do they have the capacity for specialization? And I don't think that is sufficient to call something civilized. If you're going to say that the Mongolians are uncivilized, if you're going to go say that the Huns under Attila were uncivilized, okay? So that's really important to understand. Okay, because if you look at the Huns, they were able to make their own bathhouses. they were able to develop cutting edge technology, military technology like battering rams. Okay. They had access to the same technologies that the Romans did at that time and some advancement. Okay. And I think that's why, you have a lot of shock about the Iranian war. And, it turns out that these guys have like satellites. I don't know if you know that. Did you know that they have satellites, not only drones and stuff, but actual satellites in space?
I'm not surprised, yeah.
So we always think that, some technology is a purview or the exclusive asset of one polity, but not the other, but it's not the case. Okay. It's never really been the case. Okay. And they can build their own things and they can implement it. It might be really difficult for them to do it, right? Because maybe you've sanctioned off their ability. But if they were global participants in the global economy, then they could easily make these things too, okay? And employ them certainly, okay? So we're not really thinking about, okay, I don't know, for example, the only reason why these tribes have rifles is because we manufactured it back in Britain and then we exported it over and then we're trading it for corn or something. That's not really how it works, right? For most of history. Okay, you can actually not only um, know how to have the technology, but you can actually know how to build it, right? How to generate it on your own. So technology cannot be certainly the sole criterion for whether people are civilized or not, but it should not fall into the criteria basically at all. Okay. Another way to look at this is to disprove this is that this idea that technology is relevant is that we today have much more technology than people 50 years back in the past. Are we really more civilized? Of course not, right? You could not say that we are more civilized than we were 50 years in the past, or really 400 years in the past, and so forth. Okay? We can't say those things. So what is civilization really? Okay. Civilization, we go back to the root word, has to do with civility. All right. And civility is not just being meek and nice and being a pushover. Civility is the ability to get along with other people, okay, without going to some kind of violence. Okay, not only physical violence, but emotional, psychological, financial violence. Okay, in other words, you have figured out a way to be at peace with other people in your polity, in your civilization, without being constantly distressed, without thinking that you are about to get into a fight, without thinking you're about to flee for your lives, without wondering where is the ability to pay these bills, where is the ability to stay inside this house? Okay, do I have to call the police? All right, that's civilization. Okay, it's the ability to do these things. So that's one criterion of this larger criteria, like list of criterion um, in it. Okay, so we've already become uncivilized by that measure, right? Because we can no longer get along with people and feel like life is going to be relatively quiet and peaceful. Okay, we're worried about our financial future at the very least. We're worried about what maybe the neighbors are up to. We're worried about what the sound is. We're worried about how we're getting along with our family members. That's not civilization. Okay, we have the opposite of harmony, in other words. Okay, so we have a lot of problems there. Okay, what's another way to look at civilization? Okay. Oh, so why is the West anti-civilization according to this criterion, right? Is it just that we've kind of collapsed in the last 50 to 70 years? No, it's not just that, because when we're talking about harmony and peace and harmony within and without the polities, right? Because the West refers to more than just Britain or more than just the United States or more than just France, right? We're talking about how these guys get along with each other too, right? If we're thinking about this, we don't have that because of a few reasons. One, overly individualistic, okay? Radically individualistic. That gets away with family. Okay, look at how we think about marriage, right? It's temporary. It's between two people. It ends when you die, right? Do you take this person to be your husband until death you part? Okay, that's not lifelong devotion then, right? Once one of you dies and you can move on, that's that's individualistic. Okay, I'm not using individualism to mean individual meritocracy. That's good. I'm meaning individualism as in you do what you want according to your individual, you know, values or desires. Okay, a lot of people would just simply call that selfishness. Okay, I'm talking what I want, what I think is right is to have a sense of devotion and duty, right? What is called zhong in Confucianism if we're using the Chinese language, right? Okay. Um, so where it's too individualistic. So within the family, you don't have harmony. Okay. You don't have li, right? Meaning virtual propriety, a kind of you could say maybe generically family culture, right? One that's oriented to certain things. So some people might pray at the beginning of a meal. That would be one example of li. But outside of that, they don't really follow Lee, right? When we're talking about Lee, we're talking about the whole thing, the whole experience of life, the whole behavior and conduct is like an art. Okay? Art has certain conventions. It has certain things like boundaries, right? If you're painting something, there are boundaries to that canvas, right? There are certain colors that you use, but then you have also simultaneously a lot of discretion how to implement that, how to manifest that, right? Am I making sense so far? Should I explain this a little bit more?
It makes sense.
All right. So we have that going on, okay? And that was what produces harmony. And the West for a long time just if you look at something like etiquette, etiquette is part of Lee. But the way that the British go about etiquette is basically these sorts of fancy rules, right? That kind of separate you from those who don't know the rules because they're of a lower socioeconomic class, right? It's not really about expressing morality, what's right and wrong. So if you look at Confucian rituals, a lot of them are actually simpler and clearer than British eating dining etiquette, where you have to put your peas on the fork in a certain way and stuff. It doesn't serve any morality, in other words, right? It's just kind of arbitrary and honestly odd. Okay. All right. So we have too much individualism, too much equality, right? Where people are not really recognizing, okay, this is my father, this is my uncle, that's different from my younger brother, right? That, your wife or husband is not just a friend you happen to have children with. It's, something more than that, right? There's a greater devotion there, right? You don't have these things in the West, okay? In the modern West. And even if you go back in time, you have sorts of kind of odd things that you'll find even in the chivalry period. I don't want to really go into that because that's a little bit detached. When I say the West, you could think about the modern West, particularly the last 400 years. Some of this is something you could extend all the way back through the medieval ages, the medieval era, and then certainly by the time you get back to Rome and Greece, you also again have too much individualism and too much of an emphasis on equality and all sorts of weird things there too. Okay. Um, another another reason that you don't have harmony, okay, is because there's too much of an emphasis on materialism. Okay. So rather than everybody having their place in society, both within the nation and outside the outside the nation, in other words, internationally, right? So, for example, you have the Chinese, right? The 中国 Chenzi, Chenzi. Don't think I'm not really pronouncing these things correctly, by the way. But you have the Son of Heaven, right? Not literally meaning the Son of God, right? But sort of this sort of like idea of more like maybe uh Heaven's Prince, or it's kind of like the one who is the best of humanity, okay? The one that heaven has given a mandate to um to govern, right? To lead, okay? So you have this person, and the nations around it are mostly left alone, but they do have to recognize that this person that we call the emperor, right? In Western academia, the Chinese emperor is the top guy, right? Essentially, okay. And then so you pay your mutual respect to each other, and then so you have therefore after that a mutual obligation of caring for each other in certain ways. Okay, that somebody attacks your vassal, you bring your forces to defend them, right? And then the vassals owe respect, right, and honor to the lord there, right? And then so if the lord himself is somehow attacked, then the vassals contribute towards protecting and defending that lord. And that's a very basic sense of feudalism, right? But in any case, there's an order to it, and that facilitates harmony. That's different from everybody's equal, but we also know we're not equal because people are different in terms of their power and their wealth, and also we are a little skeptical about each other because we do not get uh, to share in the same ceremonies. Okay, um, and so that is something that brings these empires and so forth, or these nation states, closer and closer to war rather than having harmony. Okay. There are other aspects regarding the West that make it basically anti-civilization, but that's kind of the major one. You can think about it's, it allows too much immigration. Okay. The problem with immigration is that you have people with a very different understanding of life and way to live life and way to communicate, not just in terms of language, but in terms of their behavior, right? What's considered acceptable? Like how many times do you have to say no to an invitation to dine at your house before you're considered rude? Or right, before you considered, you know, crude, right? Or greedy, right? Those are all really subtle things that don't have to do with language itself, right? What they told you in high school about, oh, we're studying this language so you could understand their culture, doesn't really work out, okay? Because we still speak English, but look at the English speaking world. It's changed very drastically culturally because language itself does not convey cultural values. Okay. You want to study the actual culture to do that. That's why I could talk a lot about what Confucian culture is like, even though I haven't even really lived it, and still convey this in English. Okay, because these words, um, once you explain and export or import these words like ren, yi, li, zhong, and so forth, then the rest kind of takes care of itself, right? I don't need to say Xin, I can say mind and heart, right? Um, so you don't really need to understand Chinese in order to really understand it, okay? That's why Confucianism thrived in what we call Korea today. It thrived in Vietnam, what we call Vietnam today, right? And China, there was not always one China, right? A lot of people, like the dynasties, call themselves the true China of its time, right? And they all had some degree, at least, um, influence of Confucianism, and some were better than others, right? That's just how these things kind of go, right? Um, America is kind of a more uh, pure expression, not and still an imperfect expression of libertarianism than, say, Britain, right? But you can see how both are influenced heavily by ideas of liberty, right? Okay, so we have immigration, it breaks up the cohesion of this culture, and usually nobody really allows immigration for benevolent purposes, is to exploit them as a labor source. Okay, and that's happened all throughout American history. It's never been benign, it's never been benevolent. They just want to bring in people so that they can suppress wages. Okay, that's always been the case. Now, if we're thinking about kind of other aspects, like it's oriented towards democracy, it's oriented towards individual liberty, right? That prevents the government from really stabilizing and promoting a certain kind of culture, right? And this culture that allows fine culture, good culture that allows harmony at all levels, right? Because beautiful music, beautiful stories, or at least righteous stories, right, with a good paradigm of human nature, right? I mean, your story doesn't have to always end with a happy ending. It could be a tragedy, right? But as long as it's firmly rooted in human nature and good morality, for example, Macbeth, right? Um, I mean, the protagonist dies at the end, but you also see how, he's given into evil, right? I mean, these things are very clear. Um, Maybe not clear, but they're in there, right? So as long as these stories are written with the right framework, moral framework, and ontological framework in mind, right? Meaning specifically human nature as I'm using it. As long as that's the case, then these stories can work well, right? But if they're written, right, to be something else, right, they are advocating a kind of love that is temporary in nature, right? Then you will mislead people. Okay. So the government needs to actually look out and choose and patronize and censor the right kinds of art, okay, fiction, stories, music, dance, fashion, all right, in order to properly cultivate good morals and good understanding, right understanding among the populace. Otherwise, what you're allowing is people seeking profit to essentially flatter. Okay, like a superhero story is essentially mostly a form of flattering people. Okay, everything worked out in the end is a way to flatter people. Okay, because most people, their lives do not end happily if you act like the way that the characters do. Okay, it ends in tragedy, and it ends in spiritual and moral destruction. Okay, so you have to recognize when music and stories and so forth are flattering you. They're telling you a story that's not true, so you feel better about yourself and your life, and you feel happy at the end. And in that way, it acts almost like a drug, right? It gets you to come back. All right. But if it's doing that by basically lying to you about what is right or wrong or how human beings actually are, that's poison. Okay. But that kind of thing will be produced and distributed if you take sort of this American approach to culture, which is hands off. Okay. So you have this hands off approach, and then you have these people really wrecking people's souls. And that's a big problem. Okay. So if you look at the West, it is functionally anti-civilization. Okay. They promote, or the set of values that they have basically promotes all these things that are degenerative, that are discordant, that create disharmony, chaos, disorder. And so you just really have a society that is either in conflict or simmering and just about to erupt into conflict. And that's not a place that you can call civilized.